Well, I think we've got a good quorum here joining us today. So welcome, everybody. It's such a pleasure to see you. My name is Andrew Strait. I'm the Associate Director of Research Partnerships here at the Ada Lovelace Institute. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Ada, we're an independent research and deliberative body based in London with a mission to ensure that data and AI work for people and society. Our work focuses on a number of programmatic areas that touch on the intersection of technology and society, including biometrics, COVID-19 and health technologies, ethics and accountability in practice, the future of regulation, and the use of AI and data-driven technologies in the public sector. Today's webinar is the fifth and final in a series exploring various aspects of the UK's data protection consultation, which would amend the country's data protection regime. The government's stated purpose of this consultation is to create a pro-growth and pro-innovation data regime for this country whilst maintaining world-leading data protection standards. And previous events have touched on the topics of what responsible innovation means, how the government can enable more accountable AI practices, and what lessons the COVID-19 pandemic raises around the use of personal data. Again, as I said earlier, recordings of all these events can be found on our website. But today's event turns us towards a topic of considerable interest in the UK government's proposal. How can the UK's data protection regime change to better support responsible scientific research? This is a particular focus of Chapter 1 of the consultation, a very lengthy 140-odd page document that I will not go through line by line, but this chapter does touch on proposals to consolidate and change existing rules around the use of personal data or information that relates to an identified or identifiable individual for research purposes. As this government has articulated in its recent AI strategy, one of its core goals in these kinds of attempts to reconsider these questions is ensuring the UK remains a world science superpower. The government's consultation suggests existing data protection framework could be difficult for researchers to navigate and has resulted in academic institutions applying inconsistent standards for different researchers. As such, the government suggests some ways to clarify those requirements and reduce burdens on researchers, whilst ensuring high standards of responsible research activity are met. Those include proposals to change whether data subjects should be allowed to consent to their data being used for broader areas of scientific research, even if it's not possible to specify those purposes when their data is initially collected. It includes proposals around creating clearer requirements for the use of data minimization, anonymization, and privacy-enhancing techniques in research, including a proposal to create a new statutory test that data should be considered anonymous when it is impossible to re-identify someone or it would take a long time to do so. It also looks at whether different requirements for the use of personal data should apply at different parts of the AI development process, such as requirements relating to model training and different ones for deployment. There's a whole number of other parts of this very long consultation that do apply to research, but for today's event, we hope to understand in a bit more detail how data protection intersects with responsible AI research practices. We will specifically address three questions. First, what does responsible AI research look like? And what role does data protection play in conducting responsible AI research? Second, what have the impacts of data protection regulations been on research culture, data sharing, and access to data? And third, what have the impacts of data protection regulations been on the ability of researchers to create socially beneficial research? To help us answer these questions, we're joined today by four fantastic speakers. First, Dr. Margaret Mitchell is the head of AI ethics at HuggingFace, a US-based artificial intelligence company. She has published over 50 papers on natural language generation, assistive technology, computer vision, and AI ethics, and holds multiple patents in the areas of conversation generation and sentiment classification. She previously worked at Google AI as a staff research scientist, where she co-founded and co-led Google's ethical AI group, focused on foundational AI ethics research and operationalizing AI ethics within Google. We're also joined by Dr. Gabrielle Samuel, a social scientist whose main research interests relate to the ethical issues associated with big data and AI in the health arena. Gabby is particularly interested in the environmental impacts of big data and AI technologies, particularly as they pertain to health research. She holds a Wellcome Fellowship and is exploring the environmental sustainability of data-driven health research using a case study of genomics and digital phenotyping in the UK. Brhmie Balaram is the head of AI research and ethics in the NHS AI Lab. She leads the lab's AI ethics initiative, which supports research and practical interventions that complement and strengthen existing efforts to validate, evaluate, and regulate AI-driven technologies in healthcare. Her focus is on addressing the inequalities that can emerge from the ways that AI-driven technologies are developed and deployed. She previously led the RSA Economy team's Tech and Society program. And finally, Yves-Alexandre de Montjoye is an assistant professor at Imperial College London, where he heads the Computational Privacy Group. He's currently a special advisor on AI and data protection to the European Justice Commissioner and a parliament-appointed expert to the Belgian Data Protection Agency. He was a special advisor to the European Commissioner Margaret Vestager, for whom he co-authored in 2019 the Competition Policy for the Digital Era report, and is affiliated with the Data Science Institute and the Department of Computing. I want to extend a warm welcome and thank you to all of our participants today. And we'll begin with short 3-minute interventions from each speaker, questioning this narrative that more data always delivers better research and bringing forward multiple nuances to what responsible AI research means. To start us off, I'll hand to Dr. Meg Mitchell.
Hello, thank you so much. And is my microphone coming through okay? Okay, I've been playing with my microphone, so wanted to make sure. Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate being here. I'll just say a few words about big data and the use of big data and machine learning. So one of the bottlenecks in developing machine learning systems is the role of supervision. And when we talk about supervision and supervised learning, we're talking about what kinds of information is available to a machine learning system in order for it to learn. And one of the appeals of deep learning is that we don't have to use expansive amounts of annotated data in order to learn. We can just use that data itself. The idea is that the more data you have, the better able you are to model the world as it is without need for additional kinds of annotation or curation. The problem with that viewpoint is that it ignores at least two important realities. One is the cognitive biases of the people creating that content, the text or the images of the data, and how those cognitive biases are realized in things like text or images. And two, the platforms from which the data is sourced. So in many large data sets for language models, for example, we see a lot of data from Reddit or from Wikipedia, which are both dominantly mid-20s male. And this means that we can't learn about the world as it is, but rather the world as it's represented within these contexts by these people underneath these different kinds of cognitive biases. And so what does this look like? Well, one example is that if you go to Wikipedia and search for Black history, it suggests a redirect to African-American history, which well, first reflects an American viewpoint, and second reflects a problematic American viewpoint where all Black people are from Africa. And these are the kinds of really intrinsic, inherent sort of misrepresentations of reality that you end up deeply, deeply understanding, deeply ingraining when you're scraping and learning from this kind of data. So I believe part of why there is this push to say more and more data is better is because, cynically, people don't like doing data curation. The questions are hard, they're hairy, they're sticky, consent is an issue, contestation is an issue, can you have your data removed, right? The right to contestation. And traditionally, curation has been seen as a side task, not of the same status as working on machine learning systems like optimization. And so because of this, there's been this pitch that more data is better, but I believe in many ways more data can be worse. And by paying more attention to what we're specifically sourcing and how, we can do much better with much less data.
Thank you so much, Margaret. I really appreciate that. Can I a quick follow-up on this? So it's a really good point about more data might not necessarily be better. And if we think about this notion of data protection and how they're focusing on consent, I mean, if we are to move past that mindset and one in which we're sort of creating more representative representations of the world, Is that necessarily involve consent? Is that something which researchers will have to engage with questions of consent for research subjects in AI? Or are there other ways around this that we might explore?
Yeah, so consent, can be handled in a lot of ways. I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is that there's the consent from the person who's creating the content, and consent from the people who are represented in that content. So for example, in using an image, the photographer might consent to have that image used, but it might not be the case that the people within have consented to be represented in that image and have it proliferated. And there's a misunderstanding about having a single instance versus proliferation of an instance, right? They're not the same. And so I think it is possible to get to a space where people consent to have their data used on certain platforms with the content that they are producing. That said, the people who are represented in that content would most likely have to have a contestation mechanism instead. They won't necessarily know that they're being represented, that they're being talked about, that this image of them is uploaded in this data set. There needs to be ways to query and interrogate data sets in order to understand what their representation is, and then potentially put forward requests of contestation in cases where you find yourself represented and you don't want to be. And that's very much an active area of research, how you could possibly do that. But it also would be like a very relevant way to model the different issues there.
Very interesting. So it's right of contestation, I think, is something I'm pulling from this conversation might respond. Well, I'll hand now to Dr. Gabrielle Samuel, who will lead us with her next provocation. So I'll hand to you.
Thanks so much, and thank you so much for inviting me. So you asked me to speak about how is responsible AI even possible? And to answer this, I'd like to suggest that the data governance is a really important part of the picture, as set out in the consultation document. But I feel that we really need to not be complacent in thinking that this is all that's needed. So we need to look beyond kind of data governance issues to include what has been seen as the whole life cycle of the AI model, like Kate Crawford set out in her book on Atlas of AI. So early on in the life cycle, like data storage and collection and processing include notions of data governance, such as data access and privacy, as well as the document explains, through the fairness principle, notions of diversity and representativeness and assumptions written into the data. Though just to say that I also don't agree with their solutionism approach to what's been called data fetishism, but I go along with Meg's done a great job of kind of explaining that in more detail. But I think what's missing here with this data governance approach is, for example, where are the responsibilities attached to the environmental sustainability in terms of the energy and materials used to store and process data for AI development and training? And then moving through the life cycle, if we're thinking about responsible AI research, we also need to think about societal impact, because societal impact has now become very much a part of the research process. And then societal impact relates to questions of power issues and social justice and fair distribution of resources. So who gains from the use of the AI model in society, who loses out, who has access to it? And in terms of the latter, access doesn't always mean better. So if you think of, for example, care robots and the development of care robots, because our society doesn't value human care in our economically driven growth model, then the digital divide kind of changes a little bit and is turned onto its head. And so if we think about this whole life cycle of AI, we can start to think about where responsibilities lie. And so early on in the life cycle, the consultation document is kind of trying to help to ensure responsible AI as it relates to data governance. And I felt we'd done that quite well already. But what we don't have is structures that occur later in the life cycle. And so I think there's kind of some need for some ex post review, kind of back end governance. And I'd envisage something like this to be quite sector specific. So we have this in the health sector with the MHRA and other sectors such as the airline industry with their strict regulation. So we could have something similar for AI here more broadly in different sectors. And it could be, kind of a proportional approach to the type of AI model that's being developed. And then finally, if we're thinking about responsible AI more broadly, there are many other actors that we also need to take into consideration. So, for example, the responsibility by funding bodies in terms of the type of AI research they prioritize in funding calls, for example. And then what often gets lost, news reporters and the way that they talk about the hype that's associated with the AI, and they're just a few. My colleagues and I have previously talked about this idea of an ecosystem of responsibility where everyone along the research chain has this shared understanding of what responsibility looks like, and that's kind of what we need. And I feel like we might be moving towards this shared understanding in some categories, but what we seem to be missing most importantly is an enactment of this responsibility. And I think I would like to argue, but I don't have time for, but please ask me any questions about it, is that the reason that we're missing this enactment is because the pro-economic growth climate within which AI research is occurring and which this consultation document is pushing is causing an irresponsible use of AI through competitiveness. So I'll leave it there because I've run out of time, but feel free to ask any questions.
Lots to dive into there. That's really, really interesting. I'm curious, when you talked about this sort of chain of responsibility or a sort of shared ecosystem of responsibility. If you're thinking about specifically sort of data protection issues and who's responsible for what in that process, how do you think the government should respond to the different actors that are in that chain? You know, do you envision sort of different requirements for people who are collecting or data for particular purposes or using data for particular purposes? And I was just curious about how that might relate back.
I think we need to move away from data collection, and I think we need to move away from how we're using the data and how we're processing it to what it's being used for, I think. And I'd really like to see a framework that starts to explore that puts at the center the types of values that we hold dear in our society, and reflect on that in terms of, well, what do we need from technology or anything else to get us there? So rather than thinking about, do we have specific regulations for how we process, or for how we, how we collect, how we do this? I think we'll lose sight. We get too bogged down in it. I'm not saying it's not important, but what I would like to see is more questioning around what we're using the data for, what's the final goal of that. Because I think, saying things like, public, what we often see in the health sector, public good, private bad, these dichotomizations, these polarizations are very unhelpful. And they're very unhelpful when we're thinking about the nuances of what we're trying to do with these AI technologies. So a reframing would be great.
Very interesting. Yeah, this raises a good question about the legitimate interest section of this consultation, in which the government's sort of talking about specifying more legitimate interests for the use of data without consent. But then this raises a really good question of how are those constructed and who is involved in determining legitimate interest. I think we'll come back to this. This is a really, really interesting point. But before we do that, I want to turn to Brhmie Balaram to give your provocation.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for having me. So I think that there are two ways that I could approach this question about what responsible AI research and development means in practice. So the first would be to reflect on what responsible AI R&D should entail from a public sector perspective. And the second could be to discuss our specific approach to encouraging responsible R&D within the NHS AI Labs Ethics Initiative. And I think that in the interest of time, I'd prefer to focus on the latter, but I can recommend some practical resources that go into more depth about responsible R&D for those that are interested, and perhaps we can touch on this in the follow-up questions. So that kind of brings me to the AI Ethics Initiative. Our primary focus, as you mentioned earlier, is to support and invest in research and practical interventions that could complement and strengthen existing efforts to validate, evaluate, and regulate AI-driven technologies in health and care. So we're currently curating a program of research based on what we see as priorities, although we're going to be moving to a model where we're experimenting with a bottom-up approach to making investment decisions. But the program priorities have evolved in a couple of different ways. So our starting point was reflecting on how technology has developed to date and who it has benefited or harmed historically. And we actually don't need to go very far back at all to see that racialized communities have been disproportionately impacted and adversely affected by the rollout of technologies, whether that's by the use of facial recognition systems in policing or by algorithms used for triaging or deciding patient follow-up care in the US. And so it was therefore really important for us to proactively work to ensure that racialized communities are not going to be disadvantaged yet again by the emergence of new technologies. And I think that it was through this process of setting up a research competition that focused on AI and racial and ethnic health inequalities that I came across Irene Chen's paper, Ethical Machine Learning in Healthcare, which uses a pipeline approach to prompt ethical considerations at different stages of AI development and deployment, including when selecting a problem, collecting data, defining your outcome, developing your algorithm, and starting post-market surveillance. And for me, that's been a really helpful framing that I use to articulate what we're here to do, which is to support practical interventions that could be made at different points of the AI lifecycle. So what Gabby mentioned earlier, to assure us that AI is safe, ethical, and effective. And for many of the projects that we're supporting, including our work with the Ada Lovelace Institute on developing a model for algorithmic impact assessment, what we're doing is demonstrating that there is so much more that we can do to support researchers and developers to think through the legal, social, and ethical implications of their work before they even come into contact with the regulator. And I think that as we have a more detailed discussion about GDPR, that an important thing to keep in mind is that there are limits to the law and regulation, that these mechanisms are often setting minimum standards for assurance, and that obviously while we need to be content that these standards are robust, I think that we can and should go beyond what the law or regulatory policy requires us to do in order to be satisfied that these algorithms are genuinely for public benefit.
Really great points for me. And I think this point on sort of going beyond what the law provides, I think is a really interesting one. You had mentioned, I think, a similar notion to Gabby about this sort of shared responsibility, thinking of the different parts of the life cycle. And I guess I was curious, in your work at NHSX, do you see parts of the life cycle where there are ways in which the current data protection regime is causing burdens on the ability to answer some of these questions around inequality and identifying ways in which a system might be biased or might be causing certain issues?
So I think in terms of burdens, it's not that I necessarily think that the current legislation is burdensome. But I do think that there are valid points that are raised in the consultation document about the interpretive ambiguity of some of the text, and that within the NHS, interpretations of this text can be wide-ranging, and that I would say that most people overseeing information governance tend to err on the side of caution. And for us, that has caused some unexpected delays to plans within the NHS AI lab. So two teams in particular, Skunkworks and AI Imaging, have experienced delays of many months, in one case is like 6 months and counting, to get specific projects off the ground. And I think a 6-month delay in a four-year program is a big deal. So I think that if we could get to a point where some of this legislation is clear, which I think is what they are trying to do with clarifying specific terms, for example, that hopefully that could lead to a more simplified process, because something that we do have to be mindful of is that realistically not everybody involved in information governance processes is a legal expert. And I think that a lot of these projects that we are doing at the moment are designed for public benefit and to further patient and public interests. And so the fact that we are having these issues with IG is, I think in some ways, I guess, shows that there are grounds for the current interventions that are being made as part of this consultation.
Excellent. Yes, I'm hearing a thing I'm pointing out there is this notion about interpretation, perhaps, of the law, and how that can raise challenges around sort of inconsistent guidance, which I think the consultation also references. It's a very good point. Well, before we go into the Q&A, I'll first turn to our final guest, Yves-Alexandre, to give your provocation.
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to keep it short. I think, the panel is going to be the most interesting bit. I think, I'll say that I agree absolutely with what Margaret said. I think we really need to think beyond consent. People have a tendency to reduce GDPR to consent. There's a lot more legal basis in GDPR than consent. And I think we really need to get the word out there. That also we need to go beyond consent, because in a lot of cases, as in the image case, data relates to more than one person. We have research and models showing how the reach of data collection, the detrimental network effect that you can observe in network data. So we need to go beyond consent and checkboxes. I'd be a bit provocative to say that I think, more data is not always better, for sure. But I do think that at the moment, we probably should use data more for research than we do today. But we need to do it better, and we need to learn how to do it well. I think, when reading a consultation, it's like, I think the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I think, clearly we should use data more, but we should really also 100% make sure that we retain the trust of individuals and preserve fundamental rights when using data. More specifically on anonymization, which is like, the couple of pages that I spent quite a lot of time reading again and again to try to, get at the, essence of what they're trying to do. I think I remembered a lot of the work we do for research, right, which is re-identification of poorly or incorrectly anonymous data, and really developing tags as a way to test actually whether data is anonymous or not from a technical perspective. I do think that this is missing, and that the evolution of the technology, the information available about individuals will not be contained in a legal text that is going to tell you like these are 5 checkboxes. If these 5 checkboxes are fine, then you're fine, right? I think reality is a lot more complex than this, and I think we would really be doing a disservice to both privacy and research if we were to try to condense this in 5 bullet points in a legal text. I am sympathetic to the relative approach that they emphasize in the proposal. I think it does make sense from a technical perspective. I think a lot of the work we do shows that there's no absolute anonymous data anymore. Even aggregate data, even systems that only return aggregate data, even machine learning model could contain personal data in some cases. So it doesn't make sense to have this absolute approach anymore, and I don't think that's the approach Europe is taking either. But that really means that this trade-off, this move to relative approach, needs to be balanced with really, really strong safeguards, right? Which means that no, the data is not absolutely anonymous on its own anymore, which means no, you cannot just share it because someone said it's anonymous. You need safeguards against use of law enforcement, of the data by law enforcement. You need to make sure that you have other bases to keep the data. You need to make sure that you have very strong penalties for data being re-identified or misused, anonymous data misused. You need very clear limits on how the data can be used, exactly what Gabrielle said, right? Like, anonymous data cannot be used to make decisions about you, right? That goes against the essence of what anonymous data is. So I think a lot of, sympathetic to the relative approach, but really the need to balance this with strong safeguards that are currently, not very visible, I think, in the current text. And then, quite a few questions that I have on, the consultation. I think it's interesting that a lot of examples are about research, but actually research already has, specific provisions in GDPR. If you change standards for anonymization, that's not only for research, that's for, any use of data. So if you want to help research, is anonymization really the way to go? I'm also worried of some part of the proposal taking it on the purpose of processing, which again seems to go completely against the idea of anonymization, right? Recital 26 is, it's personal data if you can re-identify it. It doesn't matter what you plan to use the data for. If I can re-identify you, I re-identify you. This is not anonymous data, independently of what you were planning to do with this data. So a bit of a concern there, and also a bit of a concern on, claims to build confidence in de-identification techniques. I think, a lot of scientific research has shown for, close to 10 years now how, de-identification techniques were actually not very robust, often decrease the value of data tremendously, or are actually vulnerable to re-identification attacks. And this is something that we've known. I mean, there's a big, excellent report by PCAST in the US, the President Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, that already said in 2015 that, de-identification is not a useful legal basis. So a bit surprised to see, 6 to 7 years later, proposals to build confidence in de-identification.
Really, yeah, very interesting points, and I think this is a really good question about how much we can rely on anonymization, pseudonymization, and other techniques. You mentioned safeguards, and I think you're right. That is a really interesting piece that is not very present currently in the Constitution. And I was just curious, are there specific safeguards that you think you would like to see in this consultation, ones that might be relevant or particular relevance to researchers?
I mean, specifically for researchers, I think, the big discussions that I've seen, right, have been around, basically researchers, we often need access, to train machine learning models or to do research to data that is as fine-grained as possible. And the more fine-grained it is, the more re-identifiable it is. So very often, we will see this trade-off, and, no amount of, k-anonymization or other de-identification technique is going to allow us to find a balance. So I think the safeguards that we need from a research standpoint are, I think, on the one hand, technical, right? There's a lot of really good privacy engineering techniques, query-based systems, ways you can, train machine learning models in privacy-preserving manner without having access to personal data, individual level data, pseudonymized data, ways you can guarantee that models do not actually leak information about individual data, and that's very much what I think we need. So a lot more, some really good, not perfect, but 99% their technology exists out there. We need to start deploying them. Open Safely is a good example. Opal is a good example. CSD are good examples of how you find the balance. And then from a legal perspective, I think there's a lot of discussions on data transfer, international data transfer for research collaborations. I think this one is a much tougher one, I think, because a lot of the examples we've seen, right? Like, examples of the head of the NIH, writing a piece in Science being like, oh, this is, GDPR is an issue. We can't transfer, DNA data of thousands of Finnish people to a government server in the US to do research. So GDPR is bad. And you're like, well, I mean, if you have no other safeguards, no, auditing of servers, no technical mechanisms, then yes, it's kind of not super surprising that GDPR does not allow you to do this. So I think there's technical approaches, and then very much what can we do legally to build safeguards to allow data to flow more and to be used more for research, which I think we all want, while preserving privacy and fundamental rights.
Very good point. Yes, I think if you're finding GDPR to be a huge problem, good place to first question is sort of what are your existing practices and why are you not compliant? It's a really good point around safeguards. Well, I want to thank you all for these very fascinating provocations, and we'll open it up now to question answers from the audience. I mean, just one that really stood out to me off the bat was building on something that we talked about as sort of like the difference of interpretation, how different researchers or institutions are interpreting the requirements from the GDPR differently, which is something the Constitution explicitly calls out as a goal to address. And Jen Pearson from the participants mentioned what concretely is not clear in current law. And I think specifically they were sort of poking on this question around the 6-month delay project that you'd mentioned, Brhmie, and what went wrong there. I was curious if you wanted to comment first on that question of how these different issues might be interpreted differently between different teams.
Yeah, so I haven't spoken to the IG teams about what their take on these specific projects are. I'm kind of relaying the issues that have cropped up in the AI lab, and that IG is actually one of our biggest barriers to taking forward some of these projects. And so I think I can't really elaborate on those specific questions. I think what I could instead offer is kind of confined to identifying that these have been issues, and that actually there are wider ethical implications, in my view, to not taking forward some of these projects because of some of the IG issues that we're having. So for example, the imaging team was seeking to use data from the National COVID-19 Chest Imaging Database for a benchmarking exercise and to ensure that the data that they've collected is sufficient for validation purposes. And I think that this work is really important because of what we know about the algorithms that were developed in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So, for example, there were researchers from the University of Cambridge that had carried out a systematic review of algorithms that have been developed in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And they found that out of thousands of papers that were related to the algorithms, that only 29 had sufficient documentation to be reproducible. 8 of these had severely biased data sets, 23 had like no external validation, and 16 out of 29 had no sensitivity or robustness analysis. And most of these algorithms have been trained on data for China, but were intended for use in Europe. And so I think that it's really important that we're able to properly validate these types of algorithms for use on their intended population in the UK. And so that, like, those are the kinds of issues that the AI Lab is currently trying to address. And that's why, like, being able to resolve these IG issues, whether that is through like clarification of like specific terms, for example, in GDPR, like scientific research or public benefit, things like that, that might be vague and that might be subject to wide-ranging interpretations, I think is really crucial.
Now, I think, Gabby, you've, not to call on you, but you've done some very similar work on this question of sort of how data governance is understood amongst researchers, AI researchers specifically in a healthcare context. And I suppose this is a really interesting question about sort of what are the ways in which the challenges for researchers arise when it comes to implementing these kinds of policies. I wasn't sure if you had any sort of additional pieces you want to add in on that point.
No, but I'd really like to respond to the next question because, and that speaks to some of my research as well. So can I do that? Is that okay?
Yeah, by all means, please do.
Do I need to read the question out so it's people?
Is this one from Ola Mikhailik? Yeah, so the temporal dimensions of AI research and development and the sort of publisher perish pressure and this notion that we're surrounded with rapid innovation, need to catch up. Many researchers face that and describe that. So the question arises of how can researchers and practitioners equip ourselves to better set the pace of AI R&D?
Yeah, and I don't actually want to answer that because I don't think I can. I just wanted to elaborate on an explanation about why. So in my research, which we're talking about, we conducted a range of interviews with health researchers that were using AI in their practices. And they really spoke about wanting to be responsible, however we wish to define that, when developing their AI models, but they felt really restricted in the competitive environment within which they work. So pretty much like what you described. So I think what the issue is that while we hear this discourse of we need responsible research to be funded and published, the issue is that at the same time funders kind of really want new and exciting, as you said, and journals want really new and exciting research. So if research is applying to publish something that's a verification of a model or applying for money to do that, they're not going to receive the money. So we're stuck in this pursuit of innovation. And I would like to argue that this is because we have wedded innovation to an economic growth model, and that this is what is problematic. And I think this is not new. This is something that scholars have been saying. I mean, we have the limits of growth, and we've had, donut economics and responsible stagnation, and they've all argued that we need to break away from this assumption that we need innovation because we need economic growth, and that we need that for human flourishing. And the problem is that if we don't move away from this model of innovation driving growth, I would argue that it's really hard to innovate in a system responsibly when the system incentivizes irresponsible behavior as being like more competitive and therefore good. And I think that speaks to what you kind of raised in your question. So while I can't really answer it because I don't know what the easy solution is without having some paradigm shift in the way that we think about innovation, the way we think about economics. All we can do is try to push for seeing other values as equally important. So not just AI as in innovation, technological innovation, but also social innovation and social values and social progress. So yeah.
Really interesting points. Yeah, and Margaret, sorry, I can see your hand raised. Also want to come in this point.
Yeah, I was just wanting to respond to that as well. I think there's a really important point here about incentive structure. And so If we're sort of in a publish or perish paradigm, something like this, the question is, what sorts of things will be able to be published? What sort of things will get the, reviewing rubric to agree with it in all these different ways? So at least from sort of an academic perspective, there could be there could be throughout our conferences more focus on how was this data sourced and collected and what are the various things in place there. Currently, there's a focus more on novelty, and situations within data are relatively ignored, which really does incentivize poor data practices. But if we can sort of set standards on what it is to do scholarly research, including with data, and include that in reviewing rubric, include that in the kinds of awards people can get, either for paper awards or sort of career awards, then I think that does start to incentivize more intelligent data practices. There was a comment there about rapid innovation and trying to keep up with rapid innovation. But I'd argue that although things are happening rapidly, they're not necessarily that innovative if their requirement is just more and more bad data, and to the point where you're using these massive compute structures that most people don't have access to and can't use at all. So it might be rapid, but perhaps not that innovative. And it's really worth thinking about which directions are we going in as we innovate, and can we incentivize those innovative directions that do prioritize, responsible use of data, and we're not doing that, at all.
This is a really good, and I can see lots of nodding heads and in the audience, if anyone else want to jump in this point. But to me, it just raises a really challenging question of how in this data protection consultation could the government help start to set some of the incentives? Are there sort of levers that in reforming data protection law this government could try to set? And I wasn't curious if anyone had any thoughts on how this government could consider doing that.
I mean, I could just say quickly that grants, at least in the US, you're really driven by what kind of grants you can get. And so at least, in the US, a lot of funding in natural language processing is driven by DARPA, which is from the Department of Defense. Which means that a lot of the technology has military uses. And so you could imagine another kind of framework where funding and grants in part is based on your work with data and responsible data, those kinds of things. And once you can start getting grants for that, then the government is now incentivizing entirely new research directions. A lot of the research directions in the US have been defined by the Department of Defense because they have provided the funding. And I think, the UK could probably do something in a non-military direction that would incentivize good practices.
Really interesting. There's also a question, I think, of legitimate interest, which we touched on briefly, sort of this notion of, are there sort of areas of research in which you could sort of use this basis to justify doing research without consent of underlying data subjects? And I was curious if that's perhaps another way in which you could set an incentive structure for certain kinds of socially beneficial research. I don't know if Gabby, you saw you had unmuted there for a second. I wasn't sure if you were coming on that or something different.
I was coming in on the point about the funding, because I totally agree with that, and that I think it's what I was trying to point out earlier, is that it controlled so much of it. So if funding could steer the direction of research into being more responsible, however we define that, then that incentive is really important. I mean, there are bottom-up incentives that are happening at the moment to get recognition, not just for publications, but for doing open data sets and, curating data sets, and, incentives for developing, responsible models as opposed to publishing. So there are those things there. I think what we've got a problem with in the UK, at least, is this push to devalue ethics, humanities, the arts, all those subjects are being devalued while STEM subjects are being pushed. And what this is going to lead to is more and more kind of tech-focused research, which is missing that kind of humanities, ethics, social science component that needs to be embedded into it. And so if we're thinking about the broader climate, I don't know what it's like in the US, Ned, but in the UK, that's where we're going. It's all about innovation, tech, much less value in terms of the humanities and social sciences. And I think that's a real problem.
Excellent. Yves-Alexandre, do you want to comment on this point? I can see you're unmuted for a second.
No, I think I agree with what Margaret said. I think it's really interesting to see, value being put on novelty, whatever that means, and how novelty is defined. And yes, I do think I agree on one point, that I think there is a strong focus on technical novelty, and not at the moment recognition in the research community on like the impact beyond inventing a new parameter to add to your loss function, as opposed to actually applying something in excellent novel ways, including doing it very well. And that's definitely not currently valued in the research community. And that's probably an issue when it comes to the development and the development and ultimately deployment of trustworthy AI.
It's a really good point. I mean, I think I'm kind of hearing a few different points around things that, if we are talking about responsible research, what this consultation could respond to, things like incentive structures, around broader impact considerations, around funding, and around sort of setting some safeguards in place. And so I want to turn to each of the panelists and just ask, if you had the magic pen of wonder and you could add anything that you wanted into this consultation, what do you think is missing, and what would you want to see added in specifically? I'll turn to Brhmie perhaps to start us off with this one, if that's all right.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, I think what I was kind of getting at earlier is that I feel like it's there to kind of support like having certain standards in place, but that these are often like kind of just getting us to like a minimum level or like a basic level of like what things should be at. And what I feel like the stuff that I'm really interested in terms of some of the ethical considerations around the use of data, like you might not even be able to explore through GDPR. So for example, I think that there are some like really interesting developments when it comes to data stewardship. So thinking about different ways that like data could be organized so that it's not just a centralized approach, whether that's like national or local, but actually thinking about like data cooperatives or like individualized approaches to data stewardship that give people like a lot more autonomy over their data. So thinking about like things like personalized online data stores. There's like a really interesting trial with one of the hospitals at Greater Manchester. So I think those are some of the things that I'd like to see going forward, and particularly like explored with the public. So I think that like one of the things that we haven't talked about is like the importance of like patient and public engagement on all of this. And I think that like one thing that we're trying to do, and we're actually trying to do with ADA, is like thinking about ways in which we can bring patients into considerations of like how like data should be used once it's accessed. So like as a condition of accessing data for the National Medical Imaging Platform that we're currently standing up, could we involve patients in the process of like determining whether or not a company should get access based on how it might impact them or other specific communities. So I think those are some really interesting questions that we want to explore, and that we might not necessarily be able to do through legislation or regulatory policy.
Really good points. I don't know if anyone else want to come in this question of sort of what you would like to see in this new bill. Gabby.
I would like to move away from this obsession for more and more data, and think carefully about what data holds value and what data does not going into the question of how we define value, but just kind of engaging with that a little bit. I think you raised an interesting point about personalized online data stores. So I've done quite a lot of work around biobanks, and I think what's quite interesting is that participants in biobanks often don't, because they've done a lot of work around broad consent, because they already have a broad consent model, and they've done a lot of work around thinking about giving more autonomy to participants in terms of dynamic consent, where they have a little bit more control of their data. But there is a sense that many participants actually don't want to be involved. Like a very small a proportion do obviously want to have that involvement, but a lot of other participants, I would argue, and this is not in health because patients often have a much more vested interest in wanting to be involved in their data, but they want the assurance that they could be involved, right? So you have a transparent, open, inclusive, democratic governance framework, and this is written into the consultation document, but I just don't believe it. So I did a lot of work on the UK COVID app, and there we saw time and time again that the government just didn't come through with being open, with being transparent, with telling the public what they necessarily wanted to hear about what was happening to their data. So I think that if nothing else, that they should come through with their promises to be open, transparent, inclusive, and democratic with how the data is being used. And then just one more tiny point that's completely not related to this. Well, it is related to this, but we need to consider the environmental implications of storing and processing more and more data. This is really important in the current climate, and I'm not seeing enough of that in the consultation.
Yes, the very timely, given the situation currently happening in Scotland, environmental question. These are very, very good points, and it's also pulling, I think, on some points that are coming up in the audience Q&A around autonomy over data, and drawing another point around contestability of data, which Margaret, you'd mentioned in your introduction. I was curious, Margaret, if you had any more thoughts to share on sort of what you'd like to see, and if sort of autonomy and contestability might be a part of that.
Oh yeah, so much to say. I'm actually working on data governance as part of my full-time job now, so it's hard not to opine just on that. I have this hopeful vision of what if everyone actually owned all of their data on their individual computers, and then they could opt in to share various things if they want or not, and then that goes on platforms, but it's on their actual computers. And this is massive distribution, right? Now it's not just some servers here and there, each person can be a server. So anyway, I think there's a lot of more work that can be done there. I really like Brhmie's points on this as well. I did want to add a bit of a cynical thing as well, though, to say that I am concerned in all of this about how research can be used as a loophole. As someone who was a researcher at a large for-profit corporation, I think I can say with confidence that this is a cynicism that is well warranted. And so I think there should be very careful articulation of what it means to be for research purposes and how this can or cannot interact with private industry, especially since, well, like things like the Cambridge Analytica scandal, situations like that haven't been as bad throughout tech, but there definitely have been tons of situations where the lines get blurred. And so I just kind of want to cynically point out that saying research is good and we have to support that can also run against some of the goals of regulating for private industry.
That is a very good point, and something that the consultation language, I think, again, focusing on legitimate interests, I think it does even include a particular call out to sort of internal research to make products better, which, is, questionable if that applies. Just really quickly on this point about contestability, there was another piece of this that came from Divya Thacker's question about the importance of thinking about this in the context of how data is generated and collected across different regions, and how there is certainly a sort of extractive nature to many data protection practices that can apply, that mirrors sort of conceptions of neocolonialist practice. And I was curious if that is something, Margaret, that you had been thinking about with contestability. How do you make a process for contesting these types of issues when in a world in which you might have researchers operating in a different language from those who are having their data collected and used? I don't know if anything you want to share on that.
Sure. Yeah, so one thing is that I think it's important to realize, I think this is to Yves' point, that as there has been need for like PII removal, anonymization, there has been great advances in anonymization practices, right? So I think this is a sort of situation where once we have a need for contestation approaches, then those will come, right? So it's like necessity is the mother of all invention. That said, I mean, working within a governance framework, you can imagine the ability to query against something, regardless of what your language is, if you're able to test with some sort of thing, be it just looking up a specific domain, some sort of identifier. if you can interrogate the data in some way, query against it, you don't have to have access to the entire data set, but you do have to have some sort of question you can ask it in order to see if it's possible that you're represented in some way. I'm still like working out the details of this, as is the entire world. But one can imagine clever ways where data has some basic indexing, and then individuals can query against those indices to see if they could potentially be in there without their consent, and then make further moves from there. You can also imagine that, similar to PII approaches, as you collect data, you can flag data instances that might need additional consent. There's no work on that I know of. I don't think most data processes even look to see if there's a copyright, like not even a little symbol, right? So I think there can be a lot more innovation on that right now, because right now there's sort of nothing.
Really interesting points. Well, with Eve, I want to turn to you. I also want to flag one other sort of kind of additional question you could consider around, just going back to the environmental point that Gabby brought up. We sort of talked about sort of privacy enhancing technologies and anonymization and pseudo-anonymization techniques. I mean, one question is, how environmentally taxing are those techniques? Is that worth the cost to the benefit of using them? And are there ways in which you could see that sort of that tension, that trade-off between more complex techniques being applied? Or do you think that isn't a trade-off to begin with? Do you think that these are actually techniques that can sort of save some of the environmental load that data collection and data practices entail? But turn to you.
Yeah, no, definitely. Maybe I just wanted to jump first on Margaret's point. I think, both control of individuals over their data, as well as, question and answer systems are, I think, like hugely important research topics that are currently completely unaddressed. I think we did a bit of work actually at the Media Lab back in 2010 on an open PDS, personal data store system, with a question and answer mechanism. But this is something that indeed, it would, it's very clear that it will become necessary at some point moving forward, but, you wonder, what's gonna unlock it in a sense. It's really like, is it gonna be regulation? Is it gonna be, one sudden really good use case? Is it gonna be research? I think it's a tough nut to crack, but, it's one that's gonna happen, I think, at some point. It has to. In terms of what's in the consultation, I think, what you wish they were to add was this magic wand. I think to me it would really be, I think, deeper thinking on how we're going to find a balance between making data more available, which I think is good for research, again with the caveat that Margaret mentioned, but also in safer ways, right? So how do we find good technical and legal safeguards and solutions, instead of, well, we want to use data for good, and this is to cure cancer, therefore we should lower our standards. No, and I really do think that there are very good ways to find a balance. We don't have to give up on one to get the other, and I think it's worth emphasizing these days, as we heard at the beginning of the pandemic. At the moment, the consultation really feel a bit too one-sided. So I think there's really a need for rebalance, even if the direction they're taking is good. And I think one specific thing would potentially be transparency. I think as soon as you give up anonymization as being this one-time absolute thing in which individuals can never be re-identified, I think you still need constantly to treat it as it could become personal data. And I think there's definitely a need for more transparency in how, even anonymous data is being used. And I think this is very close to my heart, because we struggled with these in the context of Opal, in which we were trying to make location data available for research and government policy in developing countries, in Senegal and in Colombia, and struggling with, okay, how do we inform people? How do we engage them in the process? How do we build transparency in how the data is being used? How do we build trust and confidence of what comes out of the system? Logging mechanisms, these are really tough questions, but we need to ask them. We need to build transparency to again be able to find this balance. Use data more, even if it's not always, more data is not always better, but in safer ways.
That is a brilliant way to end our time today. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I really appreciate it. Special thanks to our panelists today, Dr. Margaret Mitchell, Dr. Gabrielle Samuel, Brhmie Balaram, and Yves-Alexandre de Montjoye. I want to thank you so much for joining us. Once again, the recording of this event will be made available on our website shortly. I think within the next 24 hours, and we will have a variety of more interesting discussions, I'm sure, to come in the months ahead as the UK continues these discussions around its data protection reform. But for now, I will wish you all a lovely rest of the afternoon and a great day. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.